This is a CS Plus production brought to you by Baldwin Wallace University.
Alright, before we get started with Buzzy the Bee, what we first want to do is we want to get set up. So I'm going to show how to get set up on both Mac and Windows. So here I'm typing the URL to our GitHub repository, which will have the code that we need. Once you get to that GitHub repository, you want to click on the clone or download button, and then you'll see download zip. Go ahead and click on that. That will save that file. And then on the Mac, you want to go into Finder or open it from your downloads. And then once you have it open, you could then just go into that folder. You can move it if you want to, but we're just going to work with it right here. Now I'm going to right click on that buzz.html, and then I want to open with, I can use TextEdit, but I'm going to use Visual Studio Code just so it adds some highlighting to it. And the code keeps opening on my other monitor, so I'm going to bring that over here. And that's the code that we're going to be working with. I'm then going to go into that Buzz HTML and go ahead and open that up in Firefox. And so what this will do is that anytime I make a change to my code, I'll save that code, then I'll come back over here and then refresh that page. So now we're going to show up how to set this up on Windows. So I'm going to open up Firefox and do the same thing I did for the Mac. I'm going to type in my URL. And then once I do that, I'm going to find that clone or download button and click on that. And then go ahead and do download zip. I'm going to save that file, hit OK. And then it will be saved in my downloads on Firefox. So I'm going to go ahead and open that up by doing show all downloads. I'm going to right click on that zip file and say open containing folder. And then here I'll find that zip, and then I want to do extract all. You want to make sure that you extract the zip because otherwise editing within it may not work. And so I'm going to save this to a new folder and just call it Buzzy the Bee. I'm going to select that folder and then extract my files there. And then go ahead and click on the extract button. Now that I have it extracted, I'm going to go ahead and go into that folder, and then that Buzz.html, I'm going to right click on that and then do open with and then choose another app. Now I'm going to use Notepad here, but if you have an IDE or some other editor you want to use, you can use that. And then once I have that editor open, I'll see the code for the camp that we're going to do. And then I'll also want to open this up in a browser. So I'm going to use Firefox here. And then anytime I make a change, what I'll do is I'll save my code and then come back to the browser and refresh. And that's our setup for Windows. So now that we're all set up to start working on Buzzy the Bee, what I first want to do is just kind of show some of the files that we're going to be working with. So the main file that we're going to be working with here is buzz.html. HTML is a way of describing what is contained within a website. It's a language that's fairly easy to use, and there's many tutorials out there. This does have some complexities to it, though, because we are building a game. But the other files we're going to be working with, but we won't be editing, is a buzz.js file. And this is a JavaScript file, which essentially will contain the logic for most of our game. And it just kind of simplifies some of the things that we're going to be working with. So the first thing I want to do is I want to bring in that buzz.js file. So the way that I'm going to do that is I'm going to use something called a script tag. Now we see that script tag here, and we're going to work with that later, but let me pull that API in first, that JS file. Now if you're curious what an API is, just think of it as a way of interacting with something. So it's application programming interface, and it's a way of interfacing with another component. And that's essentially what we're going to be doing here. Now the source for this is going to be the same file. When I set up my code, I'll see it down here. And then I see that buzz.js here. You also know some other files here, some images, which we'll see later. But this also shows a way of customizing this camp once you're done with it. When we bring in an external file, we want to specify what type it is. So our JavaScript file is going to be in plain text, and the type is going to be JavaScript. And you'll notice that Visual Studio Code here automatically adds that end closing tag. If you're using TextEdit or Notepad, you may need to manually type that in. So that's step one. Step two, what we want to do is we want to define what the max rows and max columns for our game. And so these are variables. So you can think of variables as just kind of holding a value for us. And so we're going to assign a value to these. We're going to say that our game is going to have maybe 10 rows. And let's start with 15 columns. Let's see how that looks. In the webs per level, the main idea behind this game, I'm going to jump back to the images here, is we want to get Buzzy, the bee, to the honey. As he moves towards that honey, Buzzy may run into a web, and so we want to try to avoid those. Although we'll add some functionality in there to where Buzzy can remove those webs. So let's start with an initial value of 5. Now I can go ahead and save this. If I go back, I won't notice anything yet. We're still just kind of setting up the game. So I can go over here and refresh, and I really don't notice any changes yet. So the next thing I want to do, if I go to step 3 here, what I want to do is I want to keep track if I'm currently in a game. So I'm going to create a new variable here, just like how we have here where these variables are already defined for us. And I'm going to do var currently playing and set it equal to false. So this currently playing can have 1 of 2 values, true or false. So initially when we first start this game, we won't be playing a game. Now you may notice that we got step 3 here, and then we have step 5, but where's step 4? Well, step 4 is actually down in the HTML here. And so I'm going to scroll down. I'm going to find step 4. And so now that you see this div ID game board, this is the actual game board that we'll be using. Once I have that game board, I then want to essentially create it. So I'm going to do create game board, and I'm going to pass into this is a function, I'm going to pass into it the 2 values that we modified at the top of our code. So I'm going to pass in the max rows and the max columns. And if I save that and I go back here and I refresh, I should have a game board. So we see that here. Now I can click on Start Game, but it doesn't do anything yet. We're going to change that. But just so you can kind of see behind the scenes what this create game board, where that's coming from, if I go to that buzz.js file, I'm going to go ahead and open this up so you can take a look at it. This has a lot of code in here, but you'll notice that we have this create game board here. And so all that is doing is building the game board dynamically for us using that max rows and max columns values that we passed in, or those variables that we passed in. So you'll notice that we'll use some functions here like create game board or clear map. It's really just coming from this buzz.js file. So after you complete the camp, if you're interested, I encourage you to take a look inside of here. So now that we have our game board set up, the next thing that we want to do is we want to actually start the game. So you'll notice if I go back over here and I click on that Start Game button, nothing happens. So in our HTML, we actually need to add an action. We need to tell it, this is what I want you to do. Now, a lot of people think that computers are pretty smart, but they're actually not smart at all. We have to program that smarts in them. So we're going to do that here. So I'm going to add an onClick and say when I click on this, I want to start the game. Now, I call start game, but this isn't something that's given to us. If I scroll up, and you want to make sure you use a capital G here, so make sure it is case sensitive. If I scroll up and I find start game, well, that wasn't added for us. That's something that we're going to have to build. But I think we could do it. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to declare a variable. What I want to do is I want to have Buzzy start in some spot up here, and then have the honey start in some spot down here. So I'm going to do var Buzzy location and set that equal to get random ID. And this get random ID is a function within that buzz.js file. And so we need to give it a starting location. So I'm going to do, if we think about this as a grid, where our columns are labeled 0, 1, 2, 3, and so on, and our rows are labeled 0, 1, 2, 3, and so on, what I want to do is I want to get a location within there. So I'm going to give it a starting column, or I'm sorry, a starting row number. So I'm going to say pick a number between the 0th row and the 2nd row, and then pick a column between the 0th column and the 2nd column. And so that will give us a location for Buzzy. And then I'm going to do set HTML element, and this is a function within our buzz.js file. Make sure you have the case correct here, so capital H, capital E. And then I'm going to pass in that Buzzy location, and then I'm going to say get Buzzy. And that get Buzzy is also within that JS file, and all that's going to do is essentially get that image and put it at this random location. So if I save that and I go back and I refresh, if I hit start game, we see Buzzy. If I refresh again, hit start game, maybe Buzzy will be in a different spot. There's Buzzy. So that's good. We got Buzzy on there, but we need the honey. So to do the honey, we're going to do essentially the same thing. I'm going to do var honey location, and then set that equal to get random ID. Now for that get random ID, what I want to do is I want to place it in this corner here. So I want to make it pretty far away from Buzzy. Now I could just hard code some numbers in here, but if I ever change the rows or columns of my level, I want it to just kind of work if I do change those. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, well, look, if I got 10 rows, let me start off at max rows, and then -2, and then up to max rows. So max rows is 10, so that will pick a row between 10 minus 2, which is 8, and 10. And using this approach, if I were ever to change the max rows to 20, well then it would automatically work for us. And I'm going to do the same thing with max columns. Now that I got that honey location, I'm going to do set HTML element, and I'm going to do honey location, and then get honey jar. And then again, pay close attention to the case here. This style we call lower camel case. So now if a camel has humps, we kind of follow those humps on every uppercase letter for the beginning of a word. So we start with the lowercase g, uppercase h, then uppercase j. So if we save that, we go back, we refresh, and if I click on Start Game, I got my Buzzy the Bee, and then I got my honey. So now that we got Buzzy the Bee and our honey on there, let's go ahead and move to the next step. Within our Start Game, what we want to do is we want to add some webs in here, because otherwise it's fairly easy. I could just kind of move almost in a straight line to honey, but I want to add some obstacles there. So to do that, what we want to do is we want to add up to that webs per level. So we want to add 5 webs. Now to do that, this does require a little bit more complex coding that we've done so far. So anytime that we want to keep doing something, we can use something called a loop. Now the loop that we're going to use here is something called a for loop. A for loop is good anytime we know the number of times you want to do something. So I'm going to do my for loop here, and I'm going to break it down piece by piece. The first thing we're going to have is an initializer. So this is the value that we're going to initially set. So I'm going to do a var, and then webs added. And initially the webs added is going to be 0. And I want to keep repeating this loop while the webs I have added are less than the webs per level. So initially our webs per level is 5. So I'm going to keep repeating this while I add up to 5 levels. Now you may wonder, well, shouldn't this be equals? Remember, we're starting to count from 0. So initially it'll be 0, 1, 2, 3, and then 4. And that would give us 5 webs because we start counting from 0. So I'm going to remove that equal sign. And then every time I run this loop, my goal is I would have added a web. So I'm going to do webs added and then plus plus. And what that will do is it will add 1 to my webs added each time I run this loop. And that's important because we don't want this loop to run forever. Otherwise, the whole game board will be filled with webs. So the first thing I'm going to do is get a random tile ID for our webs. And I'm going to use that same get random ID that we used here. I'm going to grab any spot starting at 0, going up to the max rows, and then any column starting at 0, going up to max columns. But if I go to place that web in there, I need to check first if something was added. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to check if something already exists there. So to check if something already exists here, I'm going to use an if statement. And that if statement allows us to check for a particular condition. And so I'm going to check if that HTML element at the location is blank, meaning it's safe to add something there. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to see if there's really nothing in there. And so that double quote, there's nothing in between there, not even a space. And so that will tell me that it's empty, and then it's safe to add a web there. Otherwise, if there was something there, well, if I incremented my webs added, I should decrement it, meaning remove 1 from there. So I'm going to do webs added minus minus, and that will subtract 1. So if I end up adding 1, I'm going to remove 1 because something was already there, and I need to find another random location. So if there was nothing there, what I want to do is I want to add that web. So add that tile ID, I'm going to do get web. And that's how we add webs to our game board. So if we save that, and we go back and we refresh, I'm going to hit start game. And now I got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 random webs. I can refresh again and hit start game again. And then I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 random webs. For the next part of our tech camp, we're going to take a look at how we can actually get Buzzy the Bee to move around, how we can get the honey so we determine if we won the game or if we lost, and then how we can add new levels to our game.